mute.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here today. I am Kara Treblesmith with Iowa and Minnesota Campus Compact, and today we're here to talk about being an effective community co-educator. So what to expect from today, we're going to start with just some brief introductions, and then I'm going to talk about what we have learned from the Perceptions of Partnership study that Iowa Campus Compact conducted in 2018. And particularly, we're going to focus on the findings that were surrounding working with college students. We're going to talk about things to know as a co-educator in the community. And then there will be an opportunity for you to do some group discussion and idea generation in your own spaces. And then I'll share some resources at the very end. I wanted to provide a quick disclaimer. We are using a higher education lens for this presentation and for the things that we found through the partnership. That's where we come from in the Campus Compact land. But much of this presentation, it can be widely applied to partnerships and volunteer management, generally speaking. So I'd like to just throw that out there so that you can consider that as you work through this presentation as well. So as I said, my name is Kara Treblesmith. I am Program Manager for Community Impact at Iowa Campus Compact. My background, until coming into this role, I spent a lot of time on college campuses as a Director of Community Engagement and within higher education and student affairs. So that's kind of my background. My experiences largely come from being on a college campus and working with college students, which informed a lot of what I'm going to talk about here today, along with the partnership study. So 2 years ago, we started a Perceptions of Partnership study, which was looking at nonprofit and higher education collaboration. The research question driving this study was, how do community-based organizations, or CBOs as I'll refer to them, perceive their partnerships with institutions of higher education? So this was a pretty broad question, and the CBOs that we are looking at and that we wanted to ask for their experiences and perceptions include both those who already have existing partnerships with colleges and universities, perhaps they're pretty in-depth and ongoing, all the way to those who have maybe an interest in partnering but haven't done so yet. So we did not limit this to organizations that have existing relationships. And that's important, I think, to note for just the way that this study was designed. So for the study, we started with a short survey, which was distributed to about 900 community-based organizations in Iowa, just short of that. We had a great response rate. We got 310 responses back, and that gave us some baseline information that we used to design our focus groups, and also allowed us to recruit and generate interest in the focus groups. So of those 310 responses, about a third expressed interest in participating in a more in-depth conversation through a focus group. So we ended up having 4 of those in 3 different locations. And then we added a 5th virtual option for those who couldn't attend the in-person ones. We ended up with 40 participants who represented 39 community-based organizations. So all of that data was recorded, transcribed, and coded, and led us to the findings that we generated. A couple of things to note before I dive into some of the more broad findings or more themes. Findings are, through the survey, we really learned something that we sort of expected to find, but we're a little surprised at how high the numbers were. So partnerships between CBOs and higher ed are prolific. 98% of those who responded were already partnering with higher education, and probably even more important for us to note is that 70% partner with more than one institution. So for those on the higher ed side, this is an important statistic. Most organizations are working with not one, but multiple colleges and universities. So their perception of higher ed partnerships are gleaned from multiple relationships. We also learned that partnerships, not surprisingly, are really varied in their scope and their depth and their approach and how they work. But 3 common themes really came up through particularly the focus group conversations in ways that the nonprofits were partnering with higher ed. And that was through course-based experiences. So this is pretty self-explanatory. Organizations partnering with either a faculty or student to fulfill a credit-based experience, whether it be as an individual student or through the whole class or a small group. Individual student experiences are those sort of like an internship or a field experience. It could be just volunteering. So these might be credit bearing or not credit bearing, but where CBOs are working with one student on one experience. And then finally, there were the group student experiences. And these are what falls under this category for us was primarily student organization or Greek groups, whether it's ongoing partnerships or short-term quick partnerships for one project. This was a different set of experiences and generally speaking was not a credit bearing one. I guess I should note also that there are other ways that higher ed and CBOs are partnering with one another, but those three were the really central to the conversation and all involve the student. And that is partly why we wanted to start talking to community partners about being a co-educator, because it was such a big part of the conversation. So what we found through the study, there were 5 primary findings that we broke down into 2 major categories. So the first one was around building partnerships. Not surprisingly, we found a lot of information that sort of validated what we already knew previously from the literature, but found it more helpful to hear it in this context. So we learned that successful partnerships require a solid foundation and that effectively managing the student experience is vital. Again, a reason for us wanting to do this webinar. And then we also wanted to ask some questions. So because this really, a lot of what we heard was similar to what we know from literature around partnerships, we also wanted to talk to folks about why it's difficult to achieve effective partnerships if we know what it takes and what it requires. Why is it difficult? And what we learned was that investing time and capacity is difficult for both sides of the partnership. Partnerships exist between individuals, so rather not necessarily between organizations. So it's a relational thing. Oftentimes a partnership might be with a certain faculty member or one staff member who happens to know someone at the institution, etc. These personal relationships turn into great projects at times, but then if a person leaves or if something changes or transition happens, then it doesn't always, the partnership doesn't always continue. And then finally, something we know on the campus side to be true is that institutions of higher education are complex to navigate. So colleges and universities are very siloed. The departments and disciplines work quite a bit in isolation and don't necessarily always know what one another is doing. And that can make it difficult for partners on the community to decide to know how and where to partner. So I'm going to talk through some of these first major findings. The first 2 around building a partnership requires a foundation, and then also effectively managing the student experiences. We're going to talk more in depth about those. So I wanted to share this quote from the study that I think really speaks well to that first finding about building a foundation. Some of those times where we rush that beginning of the relationship, we rush that dating period, it can cause issues long term because we're not really knowing what each other wants and needs. This was a really common thread throughout the conversation, and that oftentimes the partners were jumping into action for the sake of trying to be efficient and trying to get things going, would jump to doing and sort of skip over some of that planning process and getting to know one another and setting expectations up, etc. And ultimately, that time often wasn't actually saved, and it wasn't actually more efficient because the partnership then was not as effective. So what we learned about building a solid foundation is that when a foundation is in place, it means that the goals and the commitments and the expectations of each partner are known. And that includes both the scope and the duration of the project. So what are you trying to accomplish and how long do you expect it to take, and how long is this commitment to one another? What needs to get done and who's responsible for doing what, and then establishing check-in points up front and maintaining consistent communication to kind of reevaluate and know when do we need to adjust and make a new path, or when are things going well, not so well, etc. I think it's important to know that when it comes to a solid foundation, it means that both partners can answer the question, what does success look like for this partnership? And that might be, hopefully it's the same for both partners, but in some cases that's not going to be the case. And so it also means that what I think will be successful or what will make this partnership successful is this, but my partner needs it to be this. And so recognizing that each of you have have an idea of what that looks like and knowing the other person's idea of success. And one thing that we really learned through the focus groups is that this process takes a lot of time. And again, investing time and capacity was a challenge for not accomplishing these goals. But while the process for building a foundation takes time, it really is worth it in the end. And without doing that, we can still achieve reciprocity, which we talk about a lot in partnerships. So there can still be a win-win, but the relationship tends to be a lot shallower and more transactional. The second major finding was that effectively managing the student experience is vital. And that's really because what we talked about before, students are central to these partnerships. However, what we learned from the focus groups is that their preparation and their accountability is not always accounted for in the partnership. There's a lot of things that could go into student preparation, but we kind of narrowed it down to these three major topics, or three areas of general professional etiquette, orientation to the organization, and the knowledge and skills needed to complete the tasks and meet the expectations set forth for them for the project. CBOs and the staff who are working with students at community-based organizations let us know that it was challenging when they weren't familiar with what the faculty and staff or the class or whatever the credit-bearing experience might be, if they were not sure what was being expected of the students. So when they could be at the table for identifying what is it that we want students to accomplish and what knowledge skills do they need to do that, what kind of training do they need to be successful, etc. That's when these partnerships worked really well. They also recognize, I think a really central part of why we wanted to do this webinar is because community-based organizations, what we learned from this partnership study is that those who were most satisfied with their partnerships with higher education really saw themselves as co-educators. So these were the folks who really valued the educational mission of the institution and wanted to be a part of that. And that makes sense because we also know that effective partnerships are those where there's aligned goals and aligned missions. And the mission of higher ed is obviously to educate students and student learning. So for CBOs to be bought into that process was important to their satisfaction with the partnership. This is sort of in contrast to the partnerships where the CBOs are sort of looking to higher ed or colleges and universities as kind of a body of volunteers, or a place where there's a lot of people and maybe folks who have some time to give to the community. That's not necessarily untrue or wrong, but in those cases, the partnerships didn't seem to be as effective. And this quote from one of our participants really speaks to that well. So in most respects, I think a higher ed partnership is about enhancing learning, real life experiences for students. So I think when you get to that level, you kind of know where you stand. It adds a nice dimension to what we were trying to do. So again, in this case, this participant really was bought into that educational experience and was happy to be a part of that and valued their role in the educational experience of the student. So that leads us to the question, what is a co-educator? And I will say for this webinar, I don't necessarily have a working definition of what a co-educator is. But for the purposes of this, it really is kind of going back to the previous slide, this idea that the community partners who our students are working with play a valuable role in that learning experience and therefore have a valuable place at the table when it comes to deciding what the design of the educational experience should look like. So based on what we learned from the study, we put forth a few recommendations around strengthening student preparation and accountability. So really quickly, I'll kind of run through these and then we'll dive into a little bit more concrete what aspects of being a co-educator might be helpful to think about. So first of all, this has been mentioned many times, but clearly defining expectations for the student, and ideally everyone's coming to the table together and working through who's doing what and what do we want the student to get from this experience. And then also, how is that going to be evaluated and who's holding that student accountable for those expectations? And I think something important to note in this, that as a community partners should feel, A, that they have they're in the position to offer feedback and provide that, and be constructive feedback, but also in the position to decide if it's not working out. And if students aren't meeting the expectations, then what happens? What are the consequences to that? And being able to set that up front is really useful. So sort of having, for example, a statement in the syllabus of a course that says failure to meet expectations will result in X, and that the community partner has a role in deciding what that is or isn't, is an important piece of this, and something that if it's not a part of the conversation when a partnership is being built, that you should feel comfortable to ask. Scaffolding experiences is something that's getting talked about more often in higher ed right now. And the idea of scaffolded experiences is essentially that students aren't all prepared for the same or ready for the same level of experience. And so recognizing that folks come in with different skill sets and different levels of skills. We can think about this as like a first and second year versus a third and fourth year student, but it doesn't obviously always fall in line with that, but for the sake of ease, we can talk about it that way. So thinking about that as a first year student, they're going to need a lot more support and maybe be told more, this is what I need to do, and here's how to do it. Whereas a fourth year student should hopefully be able to take more ownership and work more independently. For partnerships that are ongoing and lasting a long time with one student, it is a really great learning experience if you can build on and offer more accountability or more independent working environments, stuff like that, for a fourth year student who's been with your organization for a while, for example. That may not always be the case because you might be working with students for a shorter period of time, but in that case, it's just important to think about meeting students where they are and providing experiences that are appropriate for that. We all know that community-based learning oftentimes means that students are working with people who have different backgrounds and different lived experiences than them. And it's important to just engage with that and engage with the challenges that come with it and embrace the fact that this is an important part of the learning experience. And one thing that I want to point out here is that oftentimes we talk about when it comes to community-based learning experiences for students, we think about it as a student, for example, a student is coming from a place of privilege and experiencing something like poverty for the first time and isn't comfortable in that environment because they aren't familiar with it. And that's true, and those are experiences that certainly happen and we want to be aware of, and we want to help students who are coming into that setting to number one, not do harm in that community, but also to kind of learn about themselves and see what biases are coming up, what feelings are coming up, and why, and how does my lens inform the way that I'm perceiving this. But that being said, I also want to make sure that we're not erasing the experiences of the many college students who come to a community-based learning experience not from that background. We have, for example, lots of students of color who come into a community-based experience with working in a staff that's predominantly white, and that may or may not be comfortable or familiar for them. Or we have students who have access services from a nonprofit who are now going and learning and working with them in a different capacity. Those experiences are also there, and we want to make sure that those are not being erased when we have these conversations around difference. And then finally, an obvious one, but just something to point out, is just that establishing and maintaining strong communication throughout entire partnerships and projects is really critical to maintaining effective partnerships and to helping students be successful through these learning experiences. I'm not going to do a deep dive into student development theory, but just a couple things to consider here at the bottom. There's a whole body of literature around student development and what goes on for students who are in college. Lots of times this is really focusing on those traditional aged students, 18 to 24 years old, which is definitely not the majority of college students, but is oftentimes who we're working with. But some of these things are also relevant to all adults and especially young adults. So college students, first of all, are going through a pretty intense intellectual and identity development process when they are in school. And these are, so on the intellectual side, just very briefly thinking about this in a really simplistic way, it's just that they're moving from this idea of thinking black and white, very dualistic thinking. So there's right and wrong, good and bad, black and white thinking, and moving through to having a more multiplicity of thought and being able to think, well, sometimes it might be this way. Here's how what impacts the way, the way that I think about this, etc. Being able to think more critically. That's a process that students are moving through, hopefully. But again, if you're working with students who are more on that end of dualistic thinking, that's important to realize, is that they might need help thinking about things in the gray area. In terms of identity development, again, this can mean a whole lot of different things, but students are generally speaking just really figuring out who they are, whether that's their gender identity development, their racial identity development, just who they are as people. This is a really strong time for kind of working through that and figuring out who you want to be and how your background has led you to that place. And when students are kind of in the thick of that identity development, it can mean that their capacity to manage and handle other things is more limited. And there's coping mechanisms, obviously, to deal with transitions and uncertainty. And the degree to which students have those coping mechanisms will also impact, how much they have the ability to think beyond those things. So just an important thing to consider, that when you're working with college students, a lot of change is happening. They're also in a huge transition in life, and that can impact what they're able to offer and what they bring to the table. And then finally, I've also wanted to just put forth challenge and support, which is just a general idea that we use a lot in student affairs. And the idea here is that for growth to occur, students need a balance between both challenge and support. So if you have too much challenge, it can be a demotivator, and students might just want to quit because they can't be successful. And if there's too much support, then it's difficult to kind of move past and grow beyond. And finding that balance is obviously not as easy as just saying, well, we just need to challenge and support them. But keeping this in mind can be really useful in recognizing that it's sort of an individualized thing. Different students are going to need different things, and recognizing that that's kind of the role of an educator, is to help students figure out where that line is. In thinking about a learning experience, I just wanted to touch on a couple of critical components that are relatively simple to bring to a conversation around a partnership with, if you're, say, working with a faculty or a staff member on campus. These are some things that you can talk through and say, how are we thinking about learning outcomes? How are we thinking about reflection? So learning outcomes, also maybe known as student learning objectives, are exactly what they sound like. It's, what do we want students to learn? What do we want them to accomplish through this learning experience? And typically, I would say about 3 to 6 learning outcomes are pretty ideal for one experience. So it doesn't have to be really extensive, but it's just a clear way of defining what we want the outcomes to be for the educational experience. And something that's important to note about learning outcomes is just that when those are developed, then they're also connected to, so the goals of the project or the goals of the course, and then the strategies for accomplishing those goals, and then also for what's assessed and how do we assess our success or effectiveness through the partnership. All those things should be connected to and through the learning outcomes. And they should be clearly defined for all partners. And I think in an ideal world, again, as a co-educator, you're involved in some of the developing of learning outcomes for a student's experience, because you're going to be playing an important role in helping to fulfill them. So being at the table for that conversation would be great and ideal. The second piece here is reflection. Reflection is sort of a cornerstone of learning, particularly experiential learning or community-based learning. Really what it is just the link between thinking and doing. So it is the process that students go through to make meaning of their experiences. It's when it's kind of taking students and giving them the chance to think about here's something that I knew before, here's something that I've already experienced. Let me apply that to what I'm seeing and learning and experiencing now. And how does that change what I think about this? How does it change how I feel? What's my background and how is my lens connected to how I'm viewing this? Those kinds of things. And a key part of reflection is just that it occurs before, during, and after experience. So not just at the end of an internship and a student comes in and you talk to them and say, like, what did you learn from this? And have that be the first time that you're really talking through those kinds of things. And it really should be happening from beginning to end and throughout for it to be effective. And this is just a key part of the learning process and something that as a co-educator, you're really in the position to contribute to just by being a person in the student's life who can ask them critical questions and have these conversations with them. Another framework for thinking about being a co-educator, this is just one way of thinking about this, or to offer some guidelines, I guess you could say, but high impact practices are really being more widely used in higher education. And if you haven't heard, you might have heard the term, but what these are teaching and learning practices that have been widely tested. So there's a lot of research around them, and we know that they're beneficial for college students. But an important thing to know is that they're not just beneficial for college students broadly, they actually have, in most cases, a disproportionate effect, positive effect and impact on students from historically marginalized backgrounds. So this is really critical in helping us to provide an inclusive educational environment. High impact practices can be a lot of different things, but there's a list of them, and they include things like living and learning communities, faculty-student research projects, group learning experiences, and then experiential learning type things, especially, and then community-based learning is a piece of this. Community-based or service learning is a listed high impact practice. That's one that's important to this conversation specifically. And to operationalize this a bit, there are 8 key elements to high impact practices. And this list is actually, I think, most helpful because it tells us what makes these practices high impact, what is in place to help students learn and have an in-depth experience with learning. And these are all things that, in many cases, as a co-educator, you might be able to offer. And so I'm going to give you an example of how this might have been used on a campus side. So in my previous role, we worked with an off-campus federal work study program, and we decided we wanted to make the program more high impact for students. So it wasn't just about students going out and earning their work study degree with a nonprofit. We wanted there to be a defined learning experience through that as well. And so we started to shift and use this framework of high impact practices, and we worked with our community partners and just talked to our community partners and said, these are these elements that make an experience high impact. Which of these do you think you can offer? Which ones do you think you already are offering? What should come from the higher ed perspective or from our side of the partnership? How can we make this program more high impact? And kind of just talked through these different elements. So there's a couple in here that kind of relate to what we've talked about before. So performance expectations set at appropriately high levels. Again, that sort of goes back to this idea of challenge and support. So deciding what level of expectation should we be expecting from students and from this particular student. And it's important to note, I guess, that when it comes to expectations or for students, research shows that when they are appropriately high, students will rise to the occasion. So that's just something important to know, like coming in with knowing that support is going to be necessary, but also recognizing that you can have a high expectation for students, and generally speaking, they'll meet them. A significant investment of time and effort by students over an extended period of time, which is what time means, or what is extended period can mean different things. But we do want to really think about maybe how can you work with students for more than just a semester or more than just a couple of weeks for a project. The long-term projects and the long-term partnerships can really be where a lot of the impact happens. Interactions with faculty and peers about substantive matters, and then in this case also site supervisors, co-workers, anyone who's working at the community site with the students on a regular basis. Those relationships that are developed are really critical to the students' experience and can be very high impact for their learning, and shouldn't be underestimated what that means for them. Experiences with diversity, again, we talked about that. So having these experiences with people and circumstances that are different from them, and then working through it, reflecting and thinking what that means, thinking about what that means for the individual student, helping them kind of grow personally through that experience is a really valuable use of their time in college. Frequent, timely, and constructive feedback is important and something that's often lacking. This was, again, something we heard in the focus groups, is that A, not knowing if who should be offering the feedback and what that feedback should look like, but B, not having sort of set aside structure, time, and place for offering feedback. So setting that up from the beginning can be really useful, and feedback, while difficult sometimes to offer, is really helpful for students and their learning experience. And that goes along with then periodic and structured opportunities to reflect and integrate their learning. So how is what they're learning at their community site or in their community project connected to other courses that they're taking or other experiences that they've had, what they want to do with their life. Opportunities to discover relevance of their learning through real-world applications, and then a public demonstration of competence, which for community-based learning is sort of built in. It's demonstrated. It means that their work does have a real world impact, and it's being used. It's in a professional setting, and so they are having to use their skills in public, which is in and of itself an element of high impact practice. So we can take some questions here at any time for this, and then I'm going to move on to the group discussion questions that you could answer with your peers or on your own reflectively. So when have you seen students experience deep learning at your organization? What projects at your organization seem best suited to students or groups of students? And how have you sold this experience effectively to pique students' interest? How have you gotten their interest in working with you all? You can go ahead and pause here if you want to talk through these. Otherwise, I'm going to move on to some resources. So we have a few upcoming events coming up this spring that we wanted to share. So Campus Compact in both Iowa and Minnesota hosts community engagement network gatherings, where we invite both partners from nonprofits that we work with, and also the higher ed staff and faculty and community engagement professionals to just come, and they're very informal. We get together and kind of talk through what questions do people have, do introductions, just meet folks who are interested in similar things, and really hope that we're developing some good ideas and resources, but also helping people introduce each other and hopefully building some new partnerships. So we have one coming up in the Twin Cities, February 19th. There will be one in Winona, La Crosse area on April 16th in the morning, and then that same afternoon we will do one in Des Moines, and this one will be with volunteer managers of Central Iowa. You can register for all of these on our websites online. And if you're interested in getting a deeper dive into the Perceptions of Partnership study, you can find that report online at the link below, or you can just Google the title of the study and you'll find it, a PDF version. Feel free to use that as a resource and reach out if you have any questions. Thank you so much. Okay, Emily, I'm done.
Hey, okay, I'm stopping.